Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz, and I'm gradually working my way through my sort of top reads of 2024 to share with those of you that are interested. And I did non-fiction, and I think every year I kind of chop this up in slightly different ways. And my second one this year is Backlist and Classics, my top 10. And a backlist I'm defining as anything that isn't contemporary, so anything that's before published before 2020, so not really recent, and the really recent stuff 2020 onwards is still to come. So I've got 10 for you, that with the oldest being from more than 1,000 years ago, all fiction, and the newest being 2019. So, and I exclude rereads from this. I have to do that because otherwise, you just get a load of Jane Austen every year, wouldn't you? Or Virginia Woolf. Mind you, Virginia Woolf might feature this time. Well, because they're all so different, as with the non-fiction, I'm not going to rank these from like 10 to 1 or anything. But instead, you're going to get them in chronological order. So let's start with the oldest, and that is The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, translated by Royall Tyler and abridged. This is an abridgment. And I finished this on the 30th of December 2024. So thus illustrating why I can't possibly do my best ofs before the end of the year, because who knows if one of the last things that you read might turn out to be one of the best. Why is this in my top 10 of classics and backlist? I wouldn't say that in a sense it wasn't my most pleasurable read, but it was absolutely one of the most fascinating fiction reads of the year. I mean, it's one of those books that's described as one of the first ever novels. It was written, we haven't got an exact date, but sort of very end of the 10th century, beginning of the 11th century, so around 1000 CE. And it's just, why is it fascinating? It's just this amazing, vivid, well, as fiction does for you, vivid transporting of you to court life in Japan, medieval Japan, at the end of the 10th century. How fascinating is that? And it has characters, and it has plot, and it has poetry, and little bits, and it's so rich, so interesting. Not, as I say, perhaps the most fun thing that I read, but it is really enjoyable. It's not dry in any way, because it was written by Lady Murasaki to entertain her friends and other sort of members of the royal court and the Japanese nobility at the time. So it was written to be enjoyed, and it's very enjoyable. So that's number 1. Now we leap forward about 800 years, to a book from the 19th century, and that's this one. This is The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Now, why is this in my top 10 for this year? It's not actually my favourite Charles Dickens ever. I won't go off into that debate, but it's one of the most memorable reads of the year for me, because it's Charles Dickens's first novel. You really see his evolution, or sort of how he realises, as he's writing and publishing this in serialised form, that he is actually, a novelist. He can be a novelist. He can write novels from now on, and it's enormously funny. And it was just the best thing that I read in Victober this year. And, I think I will always, look back on 2024 as the year that I finally got around to reading the Pickwick Papers and thoroughly enjoyed it. So that's why this one's in there. Another Victorian book, because, you know me, I love 19th century fiction. And this one was an exceptionally enjoyable read for me, and that's The Last Chronicle of Barset by Anthony Trollope. So, for those of you who know me will know that Trollope is one of those novelists that, I just want to kind of shout about, because his books are so readable and so enjoyable, and they have a bit of everything that you need as a reader. They have characters, they have plot, they have emotions, they have an enjoyable authorial voice. He sometimes kind of steps out to sort of address you as the reader. I love that, like breaks the fourth wall. The atmosphere is great. There's sort of romance of sorts, and they're funny and sad, and just anything you could ask for from a novel, you're going to get from Trollope, in different ways, in different ones. And this was such a happy experience for me, because it's the last one in his Barsetshire Chronicles. So you could read them as standalone books, but there's a particular pleasure in reading them one after the other. And this one, he really pulls all the different threads together. So a joy, and yes, brought me great happiness. Now we move into the 20th century, and I was laughing about, if I didn't exclude rereads, there'd be a risk of Austen and Woolf just like dominating this list every year. But I do have a Virginia Woolf in my top 10, because this was not a reread. I read for the first time towards the end of 2024, The Voyage Out, which is Virginia Woolf's first novel, which I'd kind of avoided because I was thinking, first novels, how will it be? Except, of course, this is Virginia Woolf, silly me. And also, she was not a young writer when she wrote this. She was an experienced writer. She just hadn't written a novel before. She was, how old when it was published? 32, I think, when this was finally published. And she had been writing it and revising it for years and polishing it and perfecting it. It's not as modernist as her slightly later books. It's not Stream of Consciousness, but it is just has all her skill and her polish and all her ideas and all her ability to conjure up an emotional atmosphere or sort of delve into human psychology and relationships. Absolute joy, and an added pleasure, and this is a bit of a theme, I think, in why books ended up in this top 10. I buddy read this with Joe Smith, and that process makes you kind of think about a book harder. Then maybe that means that it sticks with you for longer. It's inevitable, perhaps, that those are the more likely to be the most memorable books of the year, if they are also a good book, not if they're a bad one. And that's kind of true of the next one, because this was part of a group read experience. So earlier in the year, I took part in a sort of a deep dive into the works of Elizabeth Bowen, who is a favourite author of mine already, but I read several of her books that I hadn't yet read and found my favourite ever Elizabeth Bowen, which is how happy to get to do that. And thank you, Sarah of Hardcover Hearts, for organising that group. And this is The House in Paris. It was published in, where are we? 1936. There you go. So a book from the 1930s, and it really epitomises Bowen's brilliance as a writer. Everyone's heard of Virginia Woolf. Not everyone gets to read Elizabeth Bowen, but you should. In some ways, she has some similar qualities as a writer, in that she has beautiful prose style. She has a genius for kind of exploring the unsaid in conversations between people. The implied, the uneasy psychological backdrop, the emotional atmosphere. She does amazing kind of physical descriptions of like rooms or places, conjuring things up in a few words. But she very much sort of she doesn't tell you how people are feeling. She lets you realise that through disjointed bits of dialogue, and I can't praise Bowen enough. And this is, I think, her best book, the best book. I thought, and previously my favourite was The Last September, but this, I think, is my new favourite Elizabeth Bowen. There you go. So we're kind of moving through the 20th century, and this time we've got another book in translation, and I don't have the physical copy because I lent it to Tilly and it hasn't come back, and that is The Forbidden Notebook by Alba de Céspedes. So it was written in Italian and published in 1952. The translation only came out in 2023 by Anne Goldstein. So suddenly we're all in the Anglophone world aware of this novel, but it's, I guess, an Italian modern classic and a wonderful book. Why is it so wonderful? It's written in the form of a diary, a secret diary, no less, that is kept by our protagonist, who is she's kind of like a housewife. She's a mother. She has a job as well. But she's sort of, as she writes these diary entries, it's like we're with her on this process of self-discovery, of realizing how she's allowed herself to be kind of subsumed into those roles as wife, as mother, as employee, and sort of lost herself somehow. It's introspective, quiet, devastating, brilliant. Do read it if you haven't. Of course, I say that about all these books. These are my warm recommendations, I guess. So that was from 1952. We're going to move forward again to 1964 this time, and a book that, again, I would not have read if it hadn't been for a kind of a group read thing that I was sucked into. And this book is The Stone Angel by Margaret Laurence. It's from 1964. It's a Canadian modern classic. I read it because it was chosen by a group of people who are linked to Shawn Breed's Books channel, and we read it and then had a shared discussion. And thank you so much to that group and Shawn for getting me to read this book, because how likely is it that I would have picked up a book about an older woman living in Manitoba by an author from Manitoba? It might never have come to the top of my pile. I might never even have heard of it. And it's an exceptional novel. The protagonist of this book, Hagar Shipley, is one that will stay in my mind forever. I feel like, I know her. She's not likable, but that's not the point. It's like, how often, I suppose, do you read a novel that really is completely centered on an older woman character, older, that takes her seriously, that isn't, in any way kind of patronizing, or I don't know. Those books, they're out there and they need to be cherished. Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro would be another. It's a special and something that I guess I value and appreciate. And you also get a kind of like almost like a history of the sort of European settler sort of life in Manitoba, which is not a Canadian province that one knows well if one's not Canadian, possibly even if one is Canadian, unless one's from Manitoba. So yeah, really, really satisfying and immersive book. Very glad to have read that. Then we move to the 1970s, and we're back in the UK with J.G. Farrell, who was born in England but from sort of Irish descent, and ended his life in Ireland. So he's kind of like a sort of Anglo-Irish kind of writer, I guess. And this is The Singapore Grip. And another buddy read, you see, there is a bit of a theme here. But and this was with Priscilla, the Evening Reader, and Sarah of Roadworthy. And J.G. Farrell is... It seems ridiculous to speak of him as a writer, a forgotten writer, because how can he be when he won a Booker for one of his novels, and the Lost Booker. When they did that thing of picking a winner for the year that the books had missed out when they changed the sort of the dates for how they worked out who was eligible for the book. He again won it that year, for that year, retrospectively. And those two were the first two books in his Empire trilogy, and this is the third. But I still come across people who have never heard of him and haven't read any of his books. And he won prizes for a reason. These are he has the capacity to write books that are both funny and tragic, and that really get inside the heads of the British in their imperial sort of roles in a way that is both understanding of the individuals, but simultaneously deeply critical of British imperialism. That's what he's setting out to do, is kind of take it apart, but without unfairly demonizing the individuals. They're treated, it's very humane, I suppose. He some of them are awful, some of them are ridiculous, some of them, but they're all treated as human beings, not as ciphers. This one is set in 1942, in the sort of run up to the fall of Singapore from the British to the Japanese, and a really, rewarding read. So that's the 20th century. We're now leap forward into the 21st, and that's for the last two books in my Backlist and Classics top 10. And of those, the first is Human Acts by Han Kang, our new Nobel laureate. I made a video enthusing about all the books that I've read by Han Kang, which is all of those so far available in English translation. And this one, Human Acts, was she was published in Korean in 2014, and the translation by Deborah Smith came out in 2017. I had to toss up between that and the other one that I read by her this year, The White Book. But I came down on the side of Human Acts because it's almost seared into my brain, this book. Another buddy read, as it happens, with the wonderful Ian Powell, and who I also read The White Book with, which helped, I think, kind of me spend that extra time thinking about it. But even without that, I think it would have been, as I say, seared into my head, because it's about the sort of democracy protests in a particular town in South Korea in the 1980s, and about their suppression and about the aftermath of that and the impact of that on a series of individuals. It's a distressing book, but beautifully written, and yes, extremely memorable. And if you can't stomach distressing content, don't read it. But otherwise, I would say it's of all the books that I've read by Han Kang, it's my favourite. The one that I would most sort of eagerly encourage people to read, even though perhaps The Vegetarian is more accessible. But yeah. Then number 10 in my chronological order, 10 best backlist and classic books. It was just before my 2020 kind of cutoff point, because this was published in German in 2019. And the translation was in 2022. So, and what is it? It's Marzahn, Mon Amour by Katja Oskamp, and translated by Joe Heinrich. And this is, in contrast to Human Acts, I'm ending on a happy and heartwarming note, because this is a book that's quite uplifting without being in any way cute or sugary. It's the narrator of this book decides she's a writer, but it's not that successful, her career, and she decides to retrain as someone that looks after people's feet, kind of like a chiropodist, but not as qualified as that. And then she does that, and she listens to people, and then she writes their stories. She writes the stories of her clients, she writes the stories of her co-workers. It's like it's an episodic book, like a series of short stories almost, but completely integrated, and with a sort of a story arc about her life and her sense of herself that runs through. And it's also like a picture of a community, the sort of huge kind of like housing estate which is sort of around the place that she works, and the people that live there, and with really interesting sort of, for me, kind of understanding about the German reunification and the sort of ongoing sort of tension or different sort of experience and views of people from what was the old East Germany and the West, and their relationship with each other or their attitudes to each other. So a book that I think anyone could enjoy, unlike, say, something like Human Acts, that I'd say, think twice. If you're the queasy type. That's my 10 backlist and classics. I'll be back with a top 5 poetry and plays, combined, and I think a top 20 contemporary fiction, so things from 2020 onwards, probably in a week's time. So, and as ever, I love hearing your favourites. In a way, talking about favourites, sort of classics and backlist is such a broad field. Where would you start? But if you've read a good one this year that you think I would enjoy based on the things that I've talked about, then I would love to hear it.